It is Thursday morning, it's 9:30 a.m. in Berlin and Europe, and it's Space Cafe time. Our Space Cafe Law Breakfast with Steven Freeland will begin soon. Thanks for joining us for our breakfast roundtable today. You will see this wonderful coffee house environment. We come together here, and Drew will tell us more about it in a bit. As always, we appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback. And I'm Torsten, publisher at SpaceWatch.Global, and we are a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I would like to thank all of our private and corporate supporters that showed their commitment to keep our independent journalism alive. We really appreciate that. And in case you want to join the supporter team, it's just a click away on our website. I know many of you are familiar with our websites, our bi-weekly and our daily newsletters and the Space Cafe podcast. So don't miss the latest episode, which features Nicole Colon, a NASA astrophysicist and expert in exoplanet exploration. Really a thought-provoking episode on the future of space exploration. But we also have new episodes on our Space Cafe radios for you. We published yesterday an episode about the upcoming PLD, maiden flight with Raoul Verdu, and also with Christina Nikolaus from Okapi Orbits. And from the Space Symposium, we have episodes with Andro Fayola of Astroscale or Dr. Thomas Sin of eCube. You can find our audio series wherever you get your podcasts from or on our website. And again, if you want to become a space watcher and let the world know about your cool t-shirt or your cool mugs, visit our fan shop. It's just a click away. If you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our website in the events section and on YouTube. And we will host our Space Cafe Law Breakfast with Steven Freeland live on a bi-monthly basis. With that, I'm handing over to your host, Professor Steven Freeland, still in Sydney, on his way to Vienna. Steven, floor is yours.
Oh, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Hi, Torsten. Hi, everybody. Yes, still in Sydney. It's now about 5:30 p.m. Sydney time, and I need to get out of bed tomorrow morning at 2:30. So, sorry, Donna, I'll be waking you up at 2:30 to catch a flight at some terribly early hour. On my way to Vienna, COP has now started. Antonino's already there. Lots of exciting things happening, but the most exciting thing is today, our Space Cafe, Space Law Breakfast. Torsten and I, have been really looking forward to this. It's our first Space Cafe Law Breakfast in Africa, and that is just thrilling in itself. We'll learn where we are. All of you know about our program, but for those who perhaps haven't seen earlier shows, this is our 13th edition of the Space Law Breakfast. What we're trying to do here with the inputs from incredible people, and we've got two amazing guests today, and Torsten with his reality check. What we try to do is make space law, governance, regulation, make it real, put it in context, not just look at theory, but the practicalities. What do we need to do? What do we have to stop doing? What's important? What are our priorities? And that's really a theme today with two incredible thought leaders from the future generation. All of that to come. But first, as everybody knows, and I've already hinted, we're just so excited to be in Africa. Our first tradition is to find out where we are. And so we've got Ruvimbo, Samanga, we've got Dr. Antonino Salmeri as our guests. I'll introduce them formally, but we're here at the invitation of Ru. Ru, hello, how are you? And just tell us where we are. This is so exciting.
Thank you so much, Steven, and thank you for everyone who's joined us today. I totally underestimated how sentimental this Space Cafe Law Breakfast would be. A little bit of history. I have stayed in the same neighborhood and house since I was 2. So this cafe is a cafe just a walks away from where I stay, near a nature conservancy, nice and peaceful. It's known as the Banff Lodge Hotel, and it's a very historic site. Its title deeds range all the way back to 1896. So it's a perfect place for comfort. It's a family-run hotel with lovely food. A quiet morning there is not a morning lost or not well spent, and it's a great place for dinner and friends. It's been the location for many a milestone, a conversation, and it's seen a lot of my changes over the course of the years. So please welcome to the Banff Lodge Hotel. Thank you so much again.
Wow, it's so great to be here in Bulawayo, and you have sold us all. We're all going to come and have coffee together there in person soon, I hope. Thank you for that. All right, so let's get moving. As I said, we've got 2 incredible thought leaders who, if I may say, are representative of what we might regard as future generations, the next generation of space leadership, and they themselves are representatives of future generations that come after them. And so that's what we're going to look at today with Ru, with Antonino, with Torsten. We're going to look at what I might term as, if you like, the big issues for future generations. So, we're going to look at questions like, why is it important that we conduct whatever we do in space with a view to future generations? In fact, what do we mean by future generations? What do we mean by intergenerational equity? How does that fit in with the incredibly important issues of sustainability of space activities? What are the most important priorities that the future generations need us to do now? Or can we carry on business as usual? And is that sufficient to meet this notion of sustainability, this notion of equity, and to look forward to others that come after us enjoying space? These are big questions, and we've got absolutely the right people to, I always say this, but it's true, so 2 really dear friends, Ruvimbo, Samanga, and Antonino Salmeri, who've joined us, but they are amazing people, you will hear. Let me formally introduce them. So firstly, Antonino, Dr. Antonino Salmeri. He's a space lawyer who specializes in the governance of lunar and space resource activities. He holds many degrees. I recently saw him defend his PhD, and he did an incredible job. He's now the lead of the Lunar Policy Platform at the Open Lunar Foundation. He designs inclusive, effective, impactful governance mechanisms for safe, cooperative, and sustainable development of the Moon and other celestial bodies and its resources. Within the space community, he's so highly regarded. He's the co-chair of the Space Generation Advisory Council. He's a governing member of the International Space University and a member of the IISL. He's been recognized as a young space leader by the International Astronautical Federation, and he's received the Dietrichsverschauer Award from the International Institute of Space Law. It's just great to have you, Antonino. We've also got Ruvimbo Samanga. Ru is policy analyst in the Space and Spectrum Policy team at the Access Partnership. Prior to joining Access, she was a policy analyst in space in Africa with the Open Lunar Foundation and with the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And she was there responsible for research on regional space programs, business development, policy formation. She's so prolific in her outreach and her business and education activities. She's a young space leader as well, recognized by the IAF, and she's an Open Lunar Fellow. She holds multiple degrees in law, in arts in law, and a master's in trade and investment from the University of Pretoria. Ru, it's just great to have you. Thank you. And thank you also for inviting us here to Bulawayo. So let's get started. Our next tradition, as everybody knows, is our one word to describe space. So Ru, Antonino, on the screen there, everybody can see what previous guests have said as their one word that describes what you might say is the wonder of space. My word was intergenerational. Torsten's word was ambiguous, but you can see many other words on the screen. So, Antonino, hello, it's fantastic to have you. Tell us your one word to describe space.
Thank you, Steven. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here. I am a huge fan of the Space Law Breakfast series, and to be actually a guest in this wonderful show that you and Torsten put together, it's just wonderful. So thank you so much for having me, and even more so for sharing this episode with Ru, who's a great friend and a wonderful colleague. So really very excited to be here. And I've been thinking a lot about your word, and obviously some of the guests previously already took some of those that I had in mind, including intergenerational, which I think it's very timely, especially for this episode. But my word, and the one that I really feel close to my heart, is attractive. I've always been attracted by space, especially by the moon. I got my first telescope when I was 8, and I was just staring at the moon for hours and hours, and at the stars as well. And I still do it, you know, after so many years. It doesn't matter. I just feel that magnetic attraction to space. And I think this is what we share at the end of the day. The reason why we're so passionate in this community is that when we look at the beautiful pictures from the Hubble telescope, from James Webb, we just feel that instinctive attraction to space, and we feel that we belong somehow there. We want to go there. That's why we want to explore. And so that is my word, and it defines really also why I'm so happy to be in the space community, because I feel attracted by space and the fact that I did contribute to it. It's like when you are with someone that feels you like a partner, and for me, it's really the same type of feeling.
What a great sentiment, and I think we all feel that same attraction. You know, that's a brilliant word, and I hadn't thought about it until you just mentioned it then. Yeah. Great, thank you. Okay, Ru, it's a tough act to follow, but what's your one word for space?
Very tough act. I would bounce off of Antonino and say that it is attractive. I think it's attractive for the reason that it is quintessential, which, if you know me, is a word I use quite a lot. Happy to use it as well for space. And just define quintessential from the Oxford American Dictionary, which comes from the Latin words quinta essential, did you know? Which was translated to quintessence in English. And it was originally taken to mean something that filled the universe beyond the Earth. And today the word is still being used in modern physics to describe phenomena that we can't quite put a word to right now, such as the hypothetical form of dark energy. So I also want to link quintessential to just how critical outer space is now for Earth in terms of the different space and SDG applications. So yes, let me round it off by saying we're all attracted to space because it is quintessential to our life here on Earth.
Thank you. That is great. So 2 more incredible perceptions about space. We're all going to write a book one day with all of these words. I'm going to invite everybody back to write a little chapter on their word, because I think, you know, having all of these perceptions of space really opens it up for us and makes us think about other things. So thank you both. Okay, so let's get started on the substance and why I've asked you both to come along. Of course, over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we've seen the rapid development of space, of access to space, more and more activities, more and more space actors, more and more benefits that we can potentially gain. But as I always say, what you do over here has consequences over here. And space it's quintessential, it's complex, and despite its attractions, things that are done for good reasons also may have negative consequences, and those negative consequences may constitute a threat to the future. So, Ru, to get us really started and to put all this in context, can you perhaps describe to us in general terms what you consider to be the major threats to our continued enjoyment of space, not just for my generation or your generation, but for future generations and why we need to address it.
Certainly. And I think to do so, I'll draw inspiration from the Milo Institute based at the Arizona State University. I think 3 core threats, in my opinion, would be workforce development, entrepreneurship, and as well research. I'll start with workforce development and look at the need for continuous skilling, upskilling, and reskilling of the different communities. And we recognize that space is a very highly niche environment, so we need technical personnel to sustainably use and manage our space resources. A bit of current affairs. On December 21st, Vice President Kamala Harris convened the first National Space Council. This was back in 2021, but she challenged the US Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration to inspire and develop the workforce, also recognizing that we need to engage with overlooked and vulnerable populations as an urgent and emergent need for skills and technical development. I'd like to also connect this to a recent policy development from New Zealand, where they just gave an update to their space policy, which has diversity and inclusion as a core. And a first in my eyes was their inclusion of the interests of the Maori people. And as I commented so on LinkedIn, I think it's important to include a variety of knowledge pools so that we can further bolster the moves towards stewardship, responsibility, etc. And I think last but not least on the workforce development, Nova Space, which is a professional development initiative, says that we need to move away from old training models to new training models. These can include a variety of different mechanisms that all have lifelong learning as imperatives. But to quickly run through the last 2, without taking up too much time, entrepreneurship is important. Mark Boggett, the CEO of the Seraphim Space Fund, he's just released some interesting figures on the current value of the space industry, which is now based at 469 billion United States dollars and accounts for, I think, a majority of development in different sectors. We see as well that 77% of this value is derived from the commercial market. So this shows us that entrepreneurship has a big role to play in outer space. And this growth is only expected to grow by 11% per year moving forward. So interesting to see what trade and investment related and other commercial policies will come to enable this growing industry. And lastly, research, I think, needs no further introduction. It reveals data for data-driven decision-making, and it fosters intersectoral support and dialogue. We know the ISS is a major research station, but did you know that over 2,000 spin-offs that we have here on Earth were actually derived from experiments on the ISS? Most recently with Axiom 2, we had the experiments for pluripotent stem cells to help us with disease detection and prevention. And as well, if you didn't already know, such inventions such as the vacuum cleaner, microwave, fireman suits, all were derived in some way or form from experiments in outer space. So yes, that innovation is necessary. Continue to have that wealth of innovation for life on Earth.
Wow, thank you. That's such a comprehensive idea about what we need to do. We need to plan for workforce. We need to understand entrepreneurship. I love the spin-off too, Torsten. I think we need to incorporate into future space cafes, ask people what their favorite spin-off is from space. What do you think? You know, Velcro and the vacuum cleaner and freeze-dried food. Yeah. Yeah.
It's a good point. Our host for the Space Cafe Israel, Maidat Pariente, is pushing every guest. So what is your next big thing? Or where would you put your money on in Israel? So he's doing it actively, but sure, yeah, should go for it.
Okay, that'll be it. Okay.
Bear in mind, you're talking primarily to lawyers. So just saying, just saying.
We still use vacuum cleaners though, very occasionally. Thanks, Ru. Antonino, we've just heard from Ru how important it is that we need to address, you know, these things. A legal question to a certain degree, and you're an expert in this area. As you know, in the Moon Agreement, Article 4, Paragraph 1, it refers to intergenerational equity, and there's an obligation on the states parties there too, and I quote now, give due regard to the interests of present and future generations. You know, it was a remarkable thing to include that in the treaty already in the 70s. But what do we really mean when we talk about future generations? People use that expression blithely. It's important, we know, but I think different people have different perspectives. In Australia, in my country, I know, for example, that our Indigenous people here, who are the world's first astronomers, have an incredible close connection to Earth and space. But when they think about future generations, they think about the next 7 generations forward. So given the politics of space, and we all know about that, given the sometimes short-term perspectives of actors in space, what do we really need? Do we need to agree what we're talking about? Do we need to agree about what we mean by future generations and this equity before we can really decide how we behave to protect those interests?
Thank you, Stephen. It's a great question, right? And I mean, as lawyers, don't we love definitions? And obviously, we always try to agree on something as the starting point for then discussing it in the proper way. And that's an exercise that your working group is going through. So you know how important it is. But on the other hand, while I appreciate the effort and I think the perspective of the indigenous people of 7th generation, it's one that we could definitely reflect more on, because where does this number come from, right? The problem with numbers is like you can choose 5 or 7 or 8 or 10. They are all equally important, but I think the first thing we need to do, it's a shift in perspective. Because thinking about future generation is an exercise about thinking for sure at least the next 100 years, and perhaps with 7th generation, it's even more. But it's mostly a question of like, from the idea of I have the right to use space, right, which is under Article 1 of the Aerospace Treaty, a sovereign right of all states. From that perspective to the idea of I am responsible for handing space over to those that will come after me. And those that will come after me are, starting today, it's people like me and Ruvimbo who will hopefully inherit the moon in good state from the activities that we're going to do over the next 10 or 20 years. And it's those that will come after me and her, and then those that will come after. I think the exercise is something that we haven't been really great at in the space community, which is what are the consequences of my action on everybody else? So thinking about future generation is not just a question of time, but for me, it's also a question of space. It means what is going to happen to the space environment after my space activity? What's going to happen on those who are not necessarily involved in what I'm doing, but will bear the consequences of it, including those who are not yet born, but also including those who are here and are powerless in the face of what I'm doing, which is including the young generation, but also developing countries. I think also the Moon Agreement really is probably the most forward-thinking treaty in that perspective, as it tries to really merge the interests of those who are spending a lot of money and energy in space activities with those who are not able to do that just because they inherited a different situation or because they are too young for that, but still have to be taken into account when conducting activities. And so for me, thinking about future generation and coming back to legal terms, it's a question of due regard. It's how do we implement the principle of due regard in the real sense, which for me means thinking about the holistic aspect of space activities. The fact that we're all connected and the fact that space is an environment we all share. And therefore, yes, we can say, let's have a cutoff in terms of 100, 150 years or the next 5 or 6 generations. But beyond that, which will always be relatively valid because some people might disagree on a specific number, it's really the approach. It's really the idea that we are responsible for handing over space. And we should not always look at it as something that we can use at our pleasure, but something that comes with responsibility. And I think this is a bigger problem that we have on Earth. We are not being great as well at it, but probably in space, we'll be able to have a better approach.
Yeah, look, it's so important that you say that, and I agree with you. It's ironic for me that, you know, if you look at the 5 core space treaties, the first 4 of them, you know, incredibly important, of course, but they were really putting everything in order. This is how you behave. This is how you behave. when in the Moon Agreement, we start using the word exploitation, thinking of space in a different way, at the same time, we think, okay, if we're going to take from space, we've got to think what the consequences are for future generations. I thought it was such a forward-thinking thing, as you say. Yet, we're having this conversation now, but we haven't had this conversation really about space in the 50 years since the Moon Agreement. It's just quite extraordinary. So thanks for that. What do you think, Ruvimbo? Now, we're all aware of space debris, we're all aware of unsustainable activities, we're all aware, Donald Kessler said so already in the 70s about the so-called Kessler effect, which would be, of course, a disaster for future generations. When we look at everything that's going on, the good, the bad, and the ugly, so to speak, in relation to debris, in relation to the high utilization rates of, for example, LEO, what strategies and actions do you think we need to take to address that, recognizing that, as I've said in other fora, the goals of these things can be really laudable for providing internet to everybody in the world, but the consequences are something that we need to manage. So what do you think the balance is? What's the right strategies to look at those sorts of activities?
Before I start, I'd like to give a couple of facts to contextualize the issue. You can find these facts at nanosats.eu. And firstly, nanosatellites are the growing trend for low Earth orbit for their cost advantage, of course. But did you know that as of January 2023, the figures might have changed? There are 2,138 nanosats, 1,960 CubeSats, and 80 countries have nanosats. Over 638 companies have nanosats, and there are going to be over 2,080 nanosats to launch in the next 6 years, and 633 nanosats just for 2023 alone. So we're looking at quite an incredible proliferation of nanosatellite technology in low Earth orbit. But I want to look at guideline A3 of the long-term sustainability guidelines and say that entities require institutional support to meet their policy objectives, which can come in many forms, but it is incumbent on states to create, as I mentioned in my previous point, a conducive environment within which stakeholders must operate. So for instance, if it's private companies, business incubation for commerce or innovation hubs for research, etc. But what is especially reflected in provision 4A are a certain set of standards which demonstrate how far-reaching the concept of space sustainability is, insofar that it should become part of, and this is from the LTS guidelines, part of corporate or institutional strategy. So each entity should start to consider what their corporate or institutional strategy is for space sustainability. We often assume that in determining due regard as expressed in the Outer Space Treaty that we're looking only at states' obligations, but I will quote a Professor Steven Freeland, who once said that we cannot simply do away with the existing law, but rather when new scenarios arise, we need to look at them in their context and give due interpretation as the drafter intended it. So let us continue to interpret in the context of the Outer Space Treaty. But I will have regard to further interpretations from custom that has developed. I am going to look at foreign policy, wherein perhaps we should propose a new aspect called science diplomacy, which is anticipatory science diplomacy that is trying to anticipate the potential benefits and risks of scientific advancements so that the international community can fall in line. An example of this is Switzerland chairs a UN committee on the long-term sustainability of space, and they are working on international laws to address space debris. And a Swiss startup, Clean Space, actually received a mandate from ESA to clean the low Earth orbit. So we do need that multilateral national support. To conclude on that point though, anticipatory diplomacy is to help us extrapolate future scenarios and to ensure this intergenerational equity. And this goes for all stakeholders, not just private sector. There are 4 broad categories of actors that are responsible for space sustainability. That is governments, of course. I would also add there space agencies, private companies, of course, and international organizations. But I also want to add the community, who an often overlooked category, and who really we are doing all of this for, to derive inspiration and to make life here better. So proactive policies can hinge around each of the specific categories, but the final point is a Kaizen approach is required. We need to continuously develop law as new needs arise.
Yeah, that's really good. Torsten, you've got a science background. You're a man of many skills. What do you think about this notion of science diplomacy?
I'm an engineer. I'm just an engineer, so I'm not a scientist.
Well, you know,
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's like law and policy. I mean, it sounds similar for the outside world, but they're different. And that's the same with science and engineering. I mean, Emma is our scientist in the company as an editor-in-chief, and she has a completely different viewpoint than me from time to time. But to come back here, I think it is the agreement where the international community is talking science already, and scientists are usually more open to share their research because their driver is from a usually humanity point of view, and it's not state-driven. So I think it is implemented in the diplomacy sphere already. Unfortunately, not as much as we want. If we see the discussion that happened on UNIDIR or so, they are very technically. But the question is how our diplomats, how our politicians are able to condense what is said here. And I think there is a gap between their capacity to grasp and to execute. I hope that's
yeah. Well, you know,
that's nice enough said.
Yeah, I get involved in a few diplomatic discussions nowadays, and it's really important that we have information from all sorts. We need everybody in the room, and we certainly need science and technical people as well as a whole range of other things to really understand what we're doing. So I don't think science diplomacy is a new thing. I think science is an essential essence of diplomacy, of proper diplomacy. But sadly, we also see examples of diplomacy by stealth, where people are, hiding behind other mechanisms. So I agree. Let's make it complex, but let's make it complex in a way that we understand all of the questions. Antonino, you've written this incredible book, which I know is based on your PhD, The Multi-Level Governance of Space Mining. I don't have a copy to show, but everybody, you have to go and buy it immediately.
You got a copy.
I've got a copy, but I didn't have it here in front of me. My apologies. So your book looks at the frameworks you regard as necessary for the short, medium, long term with respect to space resource activities. I've already referred to the Moon Agreement, which deals with possible future exploitation. And of course, as you know, and I have a role there, a lot's being done in COPOS through the Working Group on Legal Aspects of Space Resource Activities. Looking at space resources, from your viewpoint, and you've hinted at this before, what's at stake in the resource debate? What's at stake for future generations about resource activities? And, again, we in our working group have a mandate to develop overarching principles at some point. What principles should we consider, or not we, the member states should consider to take account of those future generations as well?
Thank you, Stephen. I think it's simple as the fact that at stake, it's our very future and our future as a space society. Right, I talked about before the freedom of exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies under Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. But if we reflect for a moment, we have only used a very limited portion of outer space and basically nothing from celestial bodies. And we have already achieved tremendous positive effects on humanity. So imagine what we can accomplish with the ability to actually utilize celestial bodies, and the activities on space resources will be key to that end. If we don't master space resources, we will not be able to take advantage and make good use of celestial bodies. But I will say that the tricky part is how to do that. So we know that we want to use space resources, and we know that they can really bring us to the next level of human evolution, either say. But the tricky part is how. And the difference is doing it in a way that is cooperative and constructive and beneficial and mindful of future generation, or conflictual, destructive, monopolistic, and to the benefit of some powerful companies or states that are able to go there in a position of advantage. And that is why the mission of your working group is so important, Stephen, because you have a unique chance to lay down this solid foundations, the overarching principles for peaceful, rational, safe, and sustainable space activities in accordance with international law. If you succeed at that, then we, as the young generation, we can use these principles to actually build the multi-level governance system that I talk about in my book, right? What I describe right now, it's the, let's say, the consequence of the fact that space and international law is inherently multi-level. There is no such thing as purely international governance. There is always some degree of national involvement because of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which requires authorization and supervision of domestic space activities. So there are always going to be a two-tier system. At the moment, we have it passive. In the future, we need to build it active. And to do that, we need good foundations. Now, as to which kind of principles we, as the young generation, would like to see and what could be helpful to build those foundations, I think at this stage, we need this high-level boundaries that we can all agree upon. And an example is laid down in the Eagle report, which I had the pleasure and privilege of leading a couple of years ago with the Space Generation Advisory Council, right? Which was the first time that the young generation spoke with a united voice on a certain topic, and that topic was lunar governance. And in the Eagle report, we proposed a charter for the governance of the moon. And I'm so happy to see that this is also very much aligned with some initiatives that are brought forward in the community by other organizations as well. And among the principles we want in the charter, for instance, is the fact that space resources activities shall be limited in time and size. I think it's a very fundamental boundary, but we need to establish it. We need to say the fact that you arrive on the moon and there is no one else doesn't give you the right to take everything you want. It doesn't give you the right to stay in infinity. You know, you can stay, but you have to stay for a limited amount of time, and you can take a limited amount of resources. Having that principle will allow us then in time, in 10 years, in 5 years, in 15 years, to say how much can you take? How much can you stay? Because we don't know right now. We don't know how much you need to actually make a solid business case on the moon. And that number will change in time. It cannot be fixed forever. It can never be just one number. I think with the deorbiting rule of 25 years that we have on Earth, we have learned that lesson. 25 years, it's a very long time. Today, you can deorbit a satellite in 5 years, right? And this has been changed by some national authority. But if we just stick to a number and think that we made it, then that's wrong. But we need to say we need those limits. And then, in addition to these high-level boundaries, we need institutional processes to fill the details and to empower young generation to participate in this process. So we need, I would say, more than COPUOS. I mean, COPUOS is going to be leading this process as it will provide a high-level direction, the mandate, the multilateral consensus legitimacy, but it doesn't have the capability to go and say for how long a space resource activity should be conducted, because it doesn't have that expertise. And again, it cannot just decide everything on its own because it's a multi-level system. And so I think we need something that can complement activities in COPUOS, that once COPUOS is given the direction and the boundaries, this multi-stakeholder platforms with expert contribution and with the participation of all actors in a meaningful way, they can go and say, okay, for the next 5 years, those are the numbers. We test them, we evaluate them, and then we move on. And we do that on a regular basis until we have established that we are fine because of the lessons that we have learned. So I think high-level boundaries and institutional processes are what we need. And in the design of those, your working group will provide the starting point, the foundations that we can hopefully build upon after the end of your mandate in 2026, 2027, when the high-level principles will hopefully be released, and then we can use that for further discussion. And in the meantime, we need the community to start thinking about these questions. That's why your working group is also ideally working in synergy with other initiatives in the community that are trying to answer these questions from a more operational viewpoint, and hopefully the two of them can complement at the end.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for pointing out how important this is. You know, I mean, I can say as the vice chair of that working group, you know, we understand exactly how important this is for everybody. But we also understand that there are many non-legal factors. And in fact, in the mandate we've got, you know, part of the deal is information gathering, and we've already got a lot of that. We've got a lot to go, but thank you for that. I mean, I think everybody is aware that whatever these high-level principles look like, and again, it's really up to the member states, this is just the beginning. And we will be learning more and more about the challenges, the possibilities, the reality, the unreality of any activity and the consequences. And so thank you for sharing that with us. Ru, you've talked already in some of your remarks about the private sector and about entrepreneurship, and we all know how incredibly and increasingly important private enterprise is to the development of the space technology, which then drives activities not just for themselves, but for the broader community and also for states. But it's something that, you know, I'm a former investment banker, and so I know that essentially private sector, notwithstanding the fact that they're all, you know, very focused now on ERG and sustainable behaviors, but they have, by and large, short-term motivations, and NGOs, and there's some brilliant ones, have short-term motivations as well in terms of their advocacy, or in the case of companies, their profits. How do you reconcile that, given how important the private sector is becoming? How do you reconcile those short-termisms, as I've used it before, with what we're talking about, the longer-term interests of generations not yet born? We need them, but how do we incorporate them in a way that is faithful to, takes due regard, whatever that means, to, you know, next generation?
I think I'll start with just a personal thought process I went through when I was looking especially at space resource utilization. And we look at the context of space resource exploitation, not so much from why are we using it, but what are we using space resources for? So I think in the context of scientific discovery and perhaps supporting human life off Earth, everything was fine, but in the context of, say, maybe commercializing these space resources, there was some kind of iffiness that did arise. So it's important to go, like Antonino said, into the definitional elements of what is use and exploration. In my opinion, it only went insofar as what is necessary and rational for development of the industry in space. But also, just to touch again on Antonino's point with regards to the influence of the industry, I think creating what's known as a collaborative baseline is both, I think, the strength and the weakness of the private industry. And I draw this from two authors from the Journal of Air and Space Law. It's a special edition on sustainability. I can't quite remember their names in this moment, but there's a chapter on technical standards where it is agreed that industry should come together to decide on uniform standards so as to have a more coordinated industry. So, of course, the ability or the extent to which this has been achieved is questionable, but there is a lot of room not only for information gathering, but also information sharing, which I think as the space industry could use a lot of work on, being more transparent, especially on upcoming plans and initiatives. And then again, there is a requisite need for the institutional support, again, drawing from my colleague Antonino. And I just want to highlight some space ethics that were released by the Department of Defense, and with no particular preference to any industry updates. I usually just pick on what I see, but I found this quite interesting. I found this interesting, and they released 5 tenets for space ethics, which really touch on, of course, the principle of due regard as the first, but also the limitation on the generation of debris, avoiding harmful interference, maintaining safe separation and safe trajectory in space, and communicating to enhance safety and stability. So I think that then goes back to the notion of we need to share more information. But there's a theme, I think, that requires more discussion in outer space, and that is what we know as tech diplomacy. That is the state-like powers that some companies start to exhibit. I'll give a couple of figures maybe to highlight this in context, but Forbes did a report where they showed that space companies received a record-breaking $14.5 billion in private investment in 2022. I believe. And as well, Citi also opined that the space industry is headed towards a $1 trillion valuation in 2040, figures that we know very well. But the top 10,000 space companies have a combined value of over $4 trillion. I mean, who has ever heard of that? So we're increasingly witnessing the art of self-regulation among stakeholders as industry development is outpacing the drafting of new regulations to address the emergence also of new business models and their concomitant challenges. So this compounds the nature of space as a global commons. And I think it's important that as these states become larger, these companies become larger, we need to incentivize responsible behavior, and there are a number of mechanisms. But companies are only one node of non-governmental entities. We cannot preclude also the role that non-governmental organizations play by providing transparency, by providing information, by also providing or gathering information in the way that Open Luna does for all moonkind, advocating for different needs, and also a grassroots approach by the Moon Village Association. So to that extent, it's becoming increasingly clear that states need to support the private sector, and at the same time, the state needs to ensure that there's no unfettered access to space in a way that disadvantages different communities and entities alike.
Yeah, I agree. But you have painted quite a positive picture. So let me turn to my dear friend Torsten, our reality check on this issue. So you've heard what we've got to say, Torsten, and Ruvimbo, I think, makes some excellent points. But you speak to the private sector all the time, Torsten. And there are some really good people with some really good ideas and really good goals. But as I repeat, as a former investment banker, the bottom line is the bottom line for most of those corporates, even the large ones. If you perhaps put aside a couple of people who are willing to throw money at space for other purposes. So, Torsten, what do you think? I mean, do you think we, states, but I mean now the broader space community, are doing enough that is necessary to meet the needs, the generational change within the space sector? Are we fulfilling our responsibilities? And I say our collectively, my generation perhaps, to Ruvimbo, to Antonino, to all they represent, to those who follow. Are we moving in our thinking towards this recognition that we need space to be able to be enjoyed for a long time? You know, you see these people all the time. You have coffee with them. You have a beer with them. So what do you really think drives the private sector in space? What's their motivations here?
To answer your question totally politically incorrect, the answer is no.
No. We're not meeting our responsibilities.
No. That's my personal point. I think we are far, far away from what we could do and what we should do. And a private company works on a very simple base in the systems we apply, and that's capitalism. So they are there to create a shareholder value for their shareholders, for for them. So, and when we see this trend of ultra-rich companies versus the so-called Mittelschicht as we have in Germany, so this is up to $1 billion company, which are obviously still very big, then we really have to ask the question if that system is still appropriate for the time we are in, that we are overusing our resources in each and every field. And it's not just space. I mean, we see it on Earth. I think, was it beginning of August that we have the World Resource Day, that we have grasped all our resources for the year already, but there's still a quarter or 1/3 of the year to go. These numbers are incorrect, but everyone can look that up. And I think we continue on that path. And it's good that we have some open discussions. And it's good that we have people like Greta Thunberg that remind us, guys, we can't continue as we go. And sure, I'm not a big fan. In Berlin, we have these people that gluing themselves on the street and they're stopping the traffic. And it's a big mess. But it's their way to cry for awareness. To say, guys, we have an issue and you don't deal with it. Dear politician, you talk nicely, but you don't deal with it. And I'm just coming back from Glock last week in Oslo. And for me, that was mind-blowing. It was a great conference and everybody hugged each other then at the end. Yes, we want to do something. Go home and nothing will happen. And that's something what I'm fearing that we have. And you're in this prestige environment with Copious and so, where all these top-level people are talking, try to find an agreement, coming home, and it's then going into the normal day-to-day business. And I think we have these pressing issues. And again, climate change is one that we are facing day by day. And when I hear, oh, we should do this conference in 3 years or 4 years again, I say, guys, maybe you don't get it. We don't have these 3 or 4 years. I mean, I don't want to say that we are gonna die in that period of time, but the world is changing and changing in a dramatic speed. And if we stop talking, or we have to stop talking and take actions, and everyone on its own, in its own behavior, and yes, it might hurt. But I think, and I had this discussion as well at home, from the mindset, people are not there. People still going on cruises, people still going on holidays because just they can. People still buy big cars with combustion engines and so on and so forth, using plastic. And that has nothing to do with space. But space is something on top of it, literally, in this case. You spoke about cleaning space, great initiatives, and we are following the work of Clean Space and Astroscale as close as we can. Absolutely. And I think they're on a great track. But honestly, what have they cleaned so far? Nothing. It is work in progress. Fine. But on the other side, we have a Starship type access to space. Not really, but it will come with hundreds and thousands of satellites per year that we are launching into space. And we not have cleaned one. So if you see, now comes the business case. What this business case is of the cleaning companies, let's say it that way, changed over time. I mean, that's a cool thing when you do the job like we do over a decade right now. So you have seen evolving that from we want to clean to, no, we want to service in space. Because servicing in space, extending lifetime, is suddenly a business. Who is paying for the cleaning? Government.
That's the short term. Yeah, you're right. I mean, that's the short-termism as well.
Yes.
And the cleaning of space, we are never going to clean space. We need to change my own opinion, and I think we're hearing that from, although I'm going to ask them now, I think we're hearing that loud and clear from Antonino and Ru. We need to change the way we think about space as well, notwithstanding.
If I may just put one thing in. We saw yesterday the announcement of the 25th signatory of Artemis with Spain. Ruvimbo mentioned already the new the New Zealand space policy. We saw, I think, 2 days back, also the announcement of the framework on space diplomacy. These are activities led by one country, by the US, the biggest player in the market. So, and now you guys in Vienna are still talking, and they're moving ahead. And I think there's a delta we have to bridge. So we have to find this coalition of willing countries, willing states, willing corporates, willing individuals, if we want to say, to move, to act.
Yeah, I agree. I'll go back to our guest, but I agree. And thank you for those incredibly powerful remarks, which I think really highlight the issues. But it's complex, right? I mean, humanity is a short-term thinker, by and large. Politicians are very short-term thinking. You know, we elect a government here in Australia, and they're already thinking about how they're going to be re-elected in 3 years' time. You know, and we don't have long-term thinking, which is why we need to hear from Ru and Antonino and all of civil society, because they are stepping back. They don't have that short-term view in the same way. So that's why these discussions are important. So coming back to you, Ru and Antonino, you've heard what Torsten and I have had to say. So if you had a magic wand and there was one thing you could change, what is that one thing you could change in the way we conduct space activities today that you believe is crucial if we're to change the way we think and properly protect the interests of future generations? How do we, and you said, Ru, about incentivization. How do we incentivize the current stakeholders to make that one change? Of course, if you get this right, you get the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, that's just a spin-off. There's a spin-off benefit from the Space Café Breakfast. But it's a tough question. So, Ru, maybe I'll turn to you first. What is that one, if it could be one thing, what is it that we need to change?
I think the most powerful thing anyone can do is change their mind. And I think people in the industry have the enormous responsibility of getting a large population of people to change their previous perceptions on space. I'm not sure on the exact figures, but I think I heard somewhere that the total number of industry career professionals in the space industry is about 1 million. Someone correct me, but 1 million as compared to a population of 8 or 9 billion, it's not a lot of hands on deck. So we have an enormous responsibility to communicate effectively to the rest of the population that we have since moved away from a winner takes all mentality. And we're trying to move now to a win-win approach, that space is not a fanciful idea. It's not a billionaire's club. It is not a pie in the sky ideal, but the more cross-border collaboration we have, it will foster inclusion and legitimize different endeavors. And in that way, if authorities and institutions and people can truly come together and bring their resources together and unify for space, who knows, it could also inspire the rest of the world that maybe this is truly a domain for all humankind in a way that we've never seen in any other sector before.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think we're very good at saying to everybody, space is different, right? Space has this incredible capacity to give us benefits, but it's a unifying thing, unlike so many other things. So I think that's a wonderful way to put it. Antonino, I love your intellect and I love your passion. So hit me between the eyes. What is the one thing that we need to change now, today, amongst everything else?
Nobel Prize question, right? So let's hit it. I think if I could change one thing, it would be to oblige every space activity to do a mandatory impact assessment. For everything that we do in space, we need at least an assessment of what's going to be the consequences on the environment and on everybody else in a time frame that expand for at least the next 20 to 50 years. I think that's the one thing, because once you have the truth in your face, then you can start act on it. But if we don't have the awareness, if we don't know what we're actually going to do, then it's impossible to take action. It's impossible to make change. Everything starts with awareness and information sharing, and then from there we can take action. So I think the first starting point would be that. And Alice in the chat mentioned the Gexler recommended framework, which has a lot of provisions on information sharing. I was fortunate enough to be the co-chair of the group on information sharing, and together with a great friend and colleague Raji Rajagopalan. And we've been working a lot, and we think that's the starting point. And then from that, what we also need, if you allow me a second magic wand, that will make another wish, and that will be to have
two Nobel Peace Prizes, then.
Right, exactly, because one is not enough. The one would be like to have a mechanism, an intergovernmental mechanism, to incorporate the perspective of future generation into decision making at the highest level. And this is not just my own wish, it's the wish of the Secretary General of the United Nations. You know that we are all building towards the Summit of the Future in 2024, and there is a series of policy briefs coming up. There is one on youth engagement, and we had the opportunity to ask questions about it last week, the member states and observers of COPWAS, to the Undersecretary General for Policy. And we asked them, like, what are you going to do for future generation? And one of the things is to create an intergovernmental body that gives the youth the opportunity to chime in decision making, because we need that institutional connection to then operationalize change. Because if you just say, I will take into account the interests of future generation, but you are not future generation, right? So let's give those that are already here the power to make a change, and at least factor them into the processes. So I think awareness, mandatory impact assessment, information sharing, it's the basis. Once you have the truth in your face, you cannot ignore it anymore. As Torsten said, people gluing themselves on the ground, or Greta Thunberg screaming and skipping school, but that starts because we know about it. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we didn't have that level of awareness, and we lost time. And so in space, we don't have time to lose, I think, and we start with that. And then we give the people that will be impacted by these changes the power and the influence to be listened and to actually operationalize the changes that we need to see through institutional mechanism, because everything starts with institution, and then the world will be a better place.
That's a great response. Just my initial reaction is the information sharing. Interestingly, at our working group, we're already talking about what might principles look like, and there's been so much focus on information sharing. I think you're absolutely right. People understand that. On the institutional mechanism, completely agree. We need to find ways that different voices have a greater hearing at where these decisions are made. But, to play devil's advocate, be careful what you wish for as well, right? Because, once you start creating monolithic institutional mechanisms, these things build a life of their own. And so we just have to do it in a tangible way. But thank you for that. Torsten, of course, we're already over time, but we've got some great questions, I believe. Do you want to raise some questions from the chat, and we'll get Ruvimbo and Antonino to give us their thoughts.
Zantu asks a very straightforward question. Thanks for that. A few countries have ratified the Moon Agreement. The big question is why? Because you spoke about it as well. Is this linked to provisions on resources extraction and utilization? Question mark. So, and I know that could be now another lecture. 90 seconds.
Okay, Ru, what's the African view on something like the Moon Agreement, for example? I mean, maybe that's an unfair question, but what do you think from your perspective about the Moon Agreement, and why has it not been particularly widely ratified?
I will admit this is not one of my strong suits, but I would say that perhaps the language of the Moon Agreement is not so accommodating to certain interests, perhaps commercialization or the resource exploitation in outer space. I think the Moon Agreement humanizes the moon insofar as it aims towards the preservation of the environmental integrity of the moon and it not being a place for geopolitical strategy. To that extent, I would say that companies and countries alike wishing to extend resource development for a variety of means would be a little bit, I would say, guarded on signing the Moon Agreement. But Antonino might know a little bit more than me on this.
Well, Antonino, I know you could speak for a long time on this, but let's have a short, succinct answer. We can all have a virtual beer afterwards to talk more, because we've got some other questions. So why is the Moon Agreement,
Stephen, in one sentence, wrong place, wrong time. Unfortunately, timing is everything in life, and the timing of the Moon Agreement was just very unfortunate. It was the negotiations of the Moon Agreement finished at the time where there was no real interest anymore in activities in the moon. And if you don't have reality backing you up, the law will just be seen as a possible obstacle to whatever might come in the future. And so I think the timing was not very fortunate. Some political misunderstandings happen as well, but I don't buy anymore, to be honest, in the narrative of the common heritage of humankind being the main obstacle, because that principle, for instance, was proposed by the very country that is opposing it today, right? And so what happened in between is politics, and it's just a way to catalyze the objection, the resistance towards regulation when it's too early. I think that was the problem of the Moon Agreement. But the big question for me is not why, if you allow me, it's what now. And the Moon Agreement has so many good provisions that we can look at and incorporate in new treaties or in new regulations. So let's make use of it and not be stuck with the conversation, is it not ratified? Should we ratify it more? Let's just, move on and use it for what we can.
Yeah, that's interesting. I gave an interview on TV the other day, and I made the point that, the moon became unfashionable just around the time when the moon, and now the moon is incredibly, I can even use the word sexy, right? The moon is now sexy, but the Moon Agreement is still there. It's still there, but as law, but, as you say, history has a way of changing perception. Anyway, great question. Thank you. Torsten, do we have time for some more?
Yes, let's go for it. Tatya Nikwashvili asked, you've mentioned technical barriers, and this question popped up to my mind. Do you think there's room for regulating commercial activities in space via the WTO forum, considering the multilateralism and the already existing WTO instruments regulating trade on Earth? Is that the way forward, or just another international consent needed body that, no, but no pressure?
I can kick off, because when I was planning, the outline of my book and my PhD, I originally had a chapter on the WTO, and then as I started writing and moving forward with my research, I completely dropped it off. Also, my committee was like too far in the future. The problem is that the WTO is a very specific mandate about trade, and the idea of putting space under that, it's just not realistic to me in the short term. We would need to have a massive import of space resources in order to justify any allocation of competences for space under the WTO. That would create, we already have a lot of issues in, balancing between Vienna and Geneva and the ITU as well, between that, and adding another institution will not solve our problem. So I unfortunately don't think that the WTO could be helpful at all. It's also a very, very politicized body in the sense that countries in the WTO pursue very important commercial interests. And so if we bring space under that, we will lose sight of the bigger picture and the importance of doing that for the future of humankind and for the benefit of all generations. So I think, unfortunately, WTO has a good institutional structure for its purposes, but I would not put space under it. But just my opinion, so I'm curious, Ru, what do you think?
Yeah, Ru, do you have any thoughts on this? I've got a few things to say as well, but do you have any thoughts?
I was fearing this moment would come. I will have to be the devil's advocate today. But as a graduate in trade and investment law, I won't say I necessarily say I support opting for existing multilateral structures, but perhaps I'll give what is currently happening in the African context. So I'll start with the World Trade Organization and say that I think they would be able to support the reduction of economic and technical barriers to trade in the space industry as a viable trade. To emphasize this, I just wanted to note an industry example. In South Africa, the Department of Trade and Industry is where the Office for Space Affairs is housed. So this is just in further recognition that the selling of goods and services from the space industry is considered a viable economic trade. So it wouldn't be too far-fetched to consider these existing structures. In the extent that this is trying to be implemented in Africa, I would note that there's a seminal agreement, which is one of my favorite words now, seminal agreement called the Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement, which is a regional trade agreement, the largest actually, since the World Trade Organization came about. And what it seeks to do is to remove the 55 borders that we have on the African continent by, first of all, opening borders to the movement of resources, people and skills, etc. And what it seeks to do is to boost, I would say, regional integration, but also to support the development of the industry through what is known as local content procedures, that is allowing for local development in a way that builds capacity and then opening up the market when the market is strong to international partnerships and growth. So to that end, if this is to work, the African Free Continental Trade Agreement has the potential to be a value of, or to be at value of $3.4 trillion, which is the largest market value currently in the world, which makes Africa also undoubtedly the future emerging market, even for space products and services. So if this would come about, it would be momentous. But I think another reason for opting for existing structures, I think, is for IP, intellectual property. As we know that the space industry is a very IP-intensive industry, we might need to call on the GATT principles. That would be, what would GATT stand for, by the way? I hope I'll type that.
General Agreement on Trade and...
On Trade and Tariffs, yes.
Yeah.
I think it certainly worked very well, at least in the industry. So I'll give that and opine that we could test it out, but it would be something useful to look into.
Great. We've got time for one more question, but just let me respond. Firstly, if you go to any intergovernmental organization and say, hey, can you take on this new responsibility? They will say, no, we don't want to do this, but where do we get the expertise? So there's all of that institutional. We can overcome that. But if we think about space as with trade as a major focus, and it's important, I get it, but it does change the way we think about space, and it moves us more towards this exploitation thing, maybe not. But the WTO has some compulsory enforcement mechanisms, and people often say that, that's good, but it only has those because states are prepared to submit themselves to that because they see there's benefits in being in the WTO. I'm not sure that the space actors, given the diversity, everybody trades in the world, but space still is very much, although it's changing, a have and a have not. I'm not sure the haves would be very happy to submit themselves to these compulsory dispute resolution mechanisms, as good as they might be. So that's just my 2 cents worth. Torsten, I know we've got time for one more question. Yes. Over to you. Yeah. I
see Ruvimbo is typing her answer already. It's a question from Tobeka, and I think that's perfect for you, Ruvimbo. Hey, Ms. Samanga, I'm a law student in South Africa, and so I wanted to find out how can one venture into space law, particularly in a continent where these opportunities are rare, if none at all. And I think there's no one else that can answer that better than you. Go for it.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this actually goes back to workforce development, as we were discussing, where there's urgent need, I think, for building space law capacity in Africa. The 2 known programs, which are quite robust, are the University of Pretoria Master's Program and as well the University of Cape Town Master's Program. which is a little bit more technical, but still espouses the more important space law principles that you would come to know. But I'd also encourage you, don't limit yourself to just South Africa or Africa in general. There are other good universities internationally with very comprehensive scholarships. There's the McGill University in Canada, there's Leiden University in the Netherlands, and also the University of Mississippi just opened up a new scholarship for people of Indigenous background. So there is a lot of inclusivity coming into the way we open opportunities and equitable access to all. If university is not, oh, sorry, come again, Torsten.
Don't forget Cologne. I mean,
and Cologne, how could I miss Cologne? Oh, Professor Huopa is going to finish me off. Cologne University is also a good one as well. But in case this is not an immediate option for you, I'd still encourage you to go the Space Generation Advisory Council route to network with other professionals who might have more insight. And the route that Antonino and I took as well was professional development through research fellowships with the Open Lunar Foundation. You'll be surprised to know that I still am waiting for my own chance to study a space law degree or program. So there's a lot of room for growth, I think, in a variety of different ways. Learning as you go as well is another viable option. So please just network as much as you can and increase your scope.
Telegraphically on SGC, Torsten, if you allow me, I think one of the focus of my chairmanship under the next 2 years will be exactly to bring more involvement in emerging regions. And I think Africa is an excellent example. And the fact that we have a very active online community also gives an opportunity to go beyond your borders, to go beyond the fact that obviously there are some, limitations in where you are, and travel, for instance, from Africa, it's also very difficult and expensive, but it will open many doors, and then it will create a stepping stone for you to go further. So I think really engage in SGC. We have regional coordinators, national point of contact that can connect you locally. And then we have project groups and policy and advocacy initiatives that can help you engage online. And then combining the two of them, hopefully you'll be able to get scholarship, which we offer to many students all around the world, especially in emerging regions, and then travel to an event and make that one connection that can change your life. And so I think SGC is welcoming all these members exactly because of that. So just come to us. We'll be happy to work with you.
And to bring that, and to, yeah, go ahead, mate. Yeah, no, up to you.
Okay, my 2 cents on that are to Baker, just read and listen to what we have to say on our website. I think we have quite some knowledge gathered over the last decade, and also something you would like to hear is we are starting a space cafe regional in South Africa very, very soon. I'm talking with the agency as we speak. So we are coming to South Africa that you don't have to find your way around.
Well, you heard it first here, ladies and gentlemen, the scoop on the Space Café Law Breakfast. Thanks, Torsten. And if I can say as well, you look at the membership of Co-Host, it's growing every year, and you look at the countries that are there now, and more of them have people in the room. When I'm there next week chairing the working group, it'll be a full house. And many of those countries don't even yet have any indigenous sovereign capabilities in space, but they recognize that they need it. So we need to have leaders from all of these countries and follow the routes that Torsten and Ru and Antonino, follow their examples and follow the routes they suggest, and reach out to people. You'll find if you reach out to people, this is a wonderful community we have, people will respond. Okay, well, I think time, like always, moves on. So back to you for a second, Torsten, and then I'll wrap up from my end after you.
I think it's up to you now to introduce the next program, and then I'm doing the next events.
Okay, well, look, firstly, what a fantastic discussion. Ru and Antonino, I'm sorry we had to cut it short, but you guys are incredible, and I learned from you so much, and I'm inspired by you, and let's see what we can do more and more. But your voices are so important, and the voices of the people that you inspire will be important. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for your insights. Thank you, Ru, for introducing us to this wonderful cafe in Bulawayo. and I hope we can all come together.
Thanks
so
for
that's
having
it
us.
for today.
But do you see, do we still not get any service here in this in the restaurant? So
well, they're all watching online, you know, the waiting stuff. Okay, so look, it's been fantastic, but you know, the show goes on. We've got our 14th Space Cafe Law Breakfast coming up on the 27th of July. Torsten, have you got a slide that we can throw up?
No, not for that.
No.
I totally forgot it. So
no problems. But on our next one, if you note it, 27th of July, 2023, we'll find the time. But we've got amazing people. Axel Cartier, who's just an expert on space-related matters, on suborbital matters, and the interaction with air, floor, and air practice. So Axel, and then the wonderful Ingo Baumann from Germany, probably one of the world's foremost, and my partner Donna is another one, but probably one of the world's foremost commercial space lawyers, and also an incredible mind. So come and join us on the 27th of July. We'll circulate a bit later on the details. Thank you again, Ru, so much. Thank you, Antonino. Torsten, you know, it's always a pleasure. We had fun, and back to you.
Absolutely. And before the 27th of July, what is again in 2 months, we have a few more events for you. And tomorrow we have our next Space Cafe Canada on a time that fits better for Canada. So it's 12 noon time Eastern, so 6 p.m. here in Central Europe. I think it's very, very, very late than in Australia, but yeah.
Everything's always late in Australia.
Yeah, I would opt for a flat Earth, but I mean, nobody is listening to me, or at least a community that I don't want to get listened in. However, next week, Emma and I will be in London for the Financial Times event, Investing in Space. So if you want to meet up there, give us a call, and we will also, or I will do also Space Comms then in Farnborough. Then on the 13th, we are planning for another Space Cafe 33 Minutes here in Berlin live from the new studio of the DLR with a guest that we have to announce. And then we have further editions of the Space Cafe Austria, Space Cafe Brazil by our wonderful Ian Grossner, and so on and so forth. So stay tuned for more information on that. And with that, I think we're almost done. All these events will be online on Eventbrite and on all the channels that you know where you can find them. As always, we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, on Facebook, or on LinkedIn, whereby Facebook, I'm not sure if anyone is using it beside me now, but it's potentially a generational thing. So, and no, we are not on TikTok and all this other stuff. So don't forget to sign up to our daily or bi-weekly newsletters. And if you like to treat yourself for something special, hey, become a Space Watcher today, as you can see on Professor Steven's chest. So that's how it looks like. And I mean, it's everyone. So take your credit card, visit our fan shop, and just click you through that. Your support is needed to continue our work. So thank you very much for your interest today. And thank you, Ru. Thank you, Antonino, for this wonderful conversation and inspiring chat. It's always a pleasure to have you in our shows. And Steven, thanks to you. Have you been happy today? I think you have. I mean, we heard it before. Yeah.
Extraordinary. I mean, it's so great. It's so great to have these.
It's so refreshing to talk with young people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, it's all relative. I still think I'm young, but
I knew he was going to say that. Yeah.
But thank you again. It's been great, and I'm already looking to our next breakfast in Germany. I think next time, Torsten.
Is it?
So,
oh, we're going to
probably.
Oh,
probably. We'll see. Or maybe Paris. We'll see. Anyway, it was great. Thanks everybody for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed.
Thanks so much, Steven. It was such a pleasure being here. Thanks, Torsten, and thanks everybody joining. It was such a pleasure.
Donna just said dinner is ready.
Dinner is ready.
Oh, I better go.
Okay, and with that, hey, don't forget, become a Space Watcher, all of you.
Become a Space Watcher. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.